You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 255, Exodus 1, Part 1. I'm the layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Hey, Mike, how you doing this week?
Pretty good.
Mike, we're about to start our long journey into Exodus.
I know you're looking for a pun there, something about
I like
leaving
that.
one location, and maybe for the wilderness wanderings, you can ask where we're at in our wanderings or something like that. But,
well, out of the gates, we already have part one of two parts of Exodus 1.
I don't want listeners to feel like they're in bondage, though.
No, we're excited to take this journey, and people have been looking for this book for quite a while, so here we are.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna start by reading chapter 1. I'm gonna, up front, this is only going to be part 1 devoted to chapter 1. We're going to have to spend two episodes in the first chapter, and I'll explain why as we get into the content here. But I think the easiest thing to do is just to read the chapter, and once we get into the content, there'll be a certain point where I'll say, "Hey, this is for part 2," and you'll understand why. So Exodus 1, again, I'm reading from ESV. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his own household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan and Naphtali; Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Raamses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live." But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this? Let the male children live." The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." Now, the very opening here, the Hebrew wording in the opening is of interest, believe it or not. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household, and then you get the list. The reason why this is interesting is that the wording that opens the book is exactly the same as in Genesis 46. If you go to Genesis 46, specifically 8 through 27, there's a much longer sort of genealogy, a much longer explanation. There are lots of other individuals in it, but it starts exactly the same way. These are the names of the descendants of Israel who came into Egypt. ESV renders it a little bit differently, but in Hebrew, the wording is exactly the same. Now that effectively alerts the Hebrew reader that Exodus is a continuation of the Genesis story of Jacob and Israel. It ties the two books together in a literary sense. And you say, well, isn't that kind of obvious? Well, it is on one level, because in our Bibles, Exodus is positioned after Genesis. we read one after the other, but there's more to the idea of continuation than just where something sits. Okay. Now, Carpenter, in his commentary, his Exodus commentary, and this is the volume in the Evangelical Exegetical Commentary produced by Lexham Press. He says this: the author's use of the formula, now these are the names, in verse 1, also parallels the use of the formula, now these are the generations of. That occurs throughout Genesis. You got Genesis 2:4, 5:1, 6:9, 10:1, 11:10, so on and so forth. It's a structural device. And so we have a sort of a structural parallel that also ties the books together. Its use here, Carpenter says, suggests that God's goals and purposes for his original creation are now being realized in an incipient Israel, unquote. Again, that's kind of obvious, but there's a little bit more to the continuity here than kind of meets the eye. I'm just going to telegraph it here. There are things, and we said this in the introduction, there are things in the text of Exodus, in the Hebrew text, that specifically repurpose, connect into, hook into specific passages in Genesis that aim at talking about the fulfillment of God's original promise to Abraham, that he would have he would have a large family, he would have many seed, they would multiply. Again, he would be the promised seed. He would be Abraham and Sarah were essentially the new Adam and Eve, because God had disinherited, he had abandoned, he had forsaken humanity at the Tower of Babel event and started over with Abram and Sarah. They were the new human family. They were the new Adam and Eve, and their descendants were, again, to sort of replace that which God had abandoned. And so that God is committed to this plan is made evident when you get these are the generations thing, and in Genesis they continue a specific line of people, specific family line. And then when you get it here, these are the names of the sons of Israel. The story is ongoing. God is still committed to it. And that becomes important because in this chapter of Exodus, Egypt, again, I'm telegraphing here, which is going to be cast as the new force of chaos, the new Babel, is attacking, trying to thwart God's purposes with his new family, and is not succeeding. In other words, God, and again, the language in the text where it hooks into back in Genesis, we're going to see some specific hooks back into Genesis 11, the Babel story, in this chapter. It's telegraphing a theological and a historical point that no matter what the forces of chaos do, God is going to fulfill his promises. He is absolutely committed to them, despite what you see going on around you. And it's a big theme in Exodus. Again, this continuity. Now, as a sidebar to this, because our audience likes these little sidebars, sons of Israel in verse 1 refers to the original migrant group of Genesis, back in the Joseph story. However, when you get to verse 7, the same phrase, sons of Israel, refers to a much larger group. And so ESV has it translated the people of Israel. So in 1:1, these are the names of the sons of Israel. Verse 7, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. Given the same wording in Hebrew and the connection of verse 1 back into Genesis, the subtle point is again that God has kept his promise to multiply Abram's seed. Jacob was the chosen son after Isaac. So the sons of Israel, in verse 1, are now seen to be greatly multiplied in verse 7. Verse 5, all the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now that gives us the sort of obvious point, is that sets, the sons of Israel in verse 1, that puts them back into the Genesis story, in the Joseph story. But there's something interesting about this as well, and I'm bringing this up because sometimes we get hung up on literalism and numbers, okay? And in this case, one is kind of more legit than the other. So Carpenter notes that the number of people who actually came to Egypt back in the day of Joseph, is actually more than 70. That means 70 is probably symbolic. Again, given the use of 70 and multiples of 7 elsewhere. You say, well, that sounds arbitrary, Mike. How can you just say that it's more than 70? Because of what it says in the Hebrew text. Now, ESV, again, those who came to Egypt, these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt. All the descendants of Jacob were 70. The word descendants there in the ESV in Hebrew is yotzei, those who came out of, or out, literally out of the body, out from Jacob himself, the man. Out of the loins of Jacob is the idea. So it only refers to Jacob's direct seed. And you have to get over the sort of the pre-modern idea of where babies come from in the Semitic, the biblical, the ancient Near Eastern world. They don't know anything about a child is the combination of two sets of, the genetics. They just don't know this. That one set of chromosomes combines with the other, and we have X number, certain number of chromosomes. They don't know any of that stuff. In the ancient world, they use the planting metaphor. The couple has sex. The man plants the seed into the woman where it grows, and then she gives birth to a child. This is why, again, I mentioned this a number of times on the podcast. This is why the Old Testament knows nothing of male infertility. It only knows female infertility. Well, I planted the seed, so there must be something wrong with you. Again, and it takes you into different, other areas of theology. But in this case, you can see it, that these 70, the descendants of Jacob, the ones who came out from Jacob, from his loins, were 70 persons. So in other words, who's not counted? Well, their wives aren't counted for one. Any other children that might have accrued maybe by adoption aren't counted. Servants aren't counted. So the actual group that migrates in Joseph's day with the 70 that came from the loins of Jacob, it's actually a bigger group than 70. Again, we don't often think about that, but what that means is that 70 doesn't really have a literal correspondence to the caravan, to the number of people who came down. It's actually a subset. 70 is actually a subset. And again, this is just how it's perceived. The ones that count in the count are the ones that actually proceeded from the loins of Jacob, again, in the way they express, birth. So it sort of opens the door to thinking differently about 70 and about numbers and about literalism when we read our Bible. Again, in this case, we get clues from the text that we're actually not talking our talk here, how we need to think about Israel in Egypt, or even on that trip in Joseph's day, that there's really not this strict correspondence, again, to the number. It's actually a subset number of the greater aggregate. And 70, of course, is used in various different ways. We're going to see it. We're going to see multiples. In the book of Exodus, we've seen them. In other books. When we did the whole temple thing with Ezekiel's temple, we did 2 episodes on that. I mean, the numbers there are pretty obviously symbolic, but this is, it's not always the case in Scripture, but it is often the case that the numbers mean something different than what you'd think they would mean. Again, just thinking of this one-to-one, literalism, this correspondence idea. Now, that might matter. Here's some telegraphing. That might matter when we start to think about the date of the Exodus. Okay, that's all I'll say for now. Again, our part 2 is going to really focus on chronological stuff, but just hold this thought, in your head until the part 2 of Exodus 1, because one of the views of the Exodus is going to have to not take certain numbers literally, and the other one is going to insist on taking numbers literally. So just store that away. Now, verse 8. Again, this is what we do in our when we do book studies. I'll just skip around. We don't do verse by verse. I want to land on things that are interesting, things that need to be understood, or just again, some of these sidebar issues. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. It's very easy to be reading in the book of Genesis. And Genesis 37 through 50 is all about Joseph. Okay. And then you get to Genesis 50 and Joseph dies and he's embalmed and so on and so forth. And then you flip the page and you read this in Exodus. There arose a king over Egypt who didn't know Joseph. It's very easy to think that the king referred to here was the king immediately after the king, the pharaoh that Joseph worked under. That is not the case. It can't be. Because by the time we get to verse 8, Israel has expanded exponentially. And we know from other passages in the Old Testament, like Genesis 15, that Israel was going to be captive for at least 400 years. I mean, depending on how you measure when the start began, Paul has a reference to 430 years. And when we get into the chronology of that, we could, maybe we'll rabbit trail on that sidebar. We'll just wait and see. But what you have here is you have a long stretch of time between Joseph and between the events of Exodus 1. So if we could know, and we really can't, and we'll get into that a little bit today and a lot in part 2, who the Pharaoh was that Joseph served under, even the era in Egyptian history where Joseph would be placed is hotly debated. We can't assume that the Pharaoh of the bondage is the next guy. Okay, and if we knew the Pharaoh of the bondage, we can't extrapolate backward to the time of Joseph, because we don't, we can't just say it's the preceding guy. We've got these round numbers, 400 or 430, again going with Paul, as to the space of time between Joseph's rise, the entry, really the entry of the family, leaving Canaan and going into Egypt, and then this chapter here in Exodus 1. Carpenter writes here, this Pharaoh, again, this king, there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. This Pharaoh was not acquainted with the previous history of Joseph and Israel in Egypt, or at least he didn't choose to acknowledge Israel and her past relationships with Egypt. More importantly, Carpenter says, he lacked a knowledge of or refused to grant any significance to the close friendships that Joseph and Israel had cultivated with past pharaohs, plural, and Egyptians. The writer does not give the king's name, nor are the pharaoh's names given in Genesis. So we don't know who this person was. We don't get any help by appealing back to the Genesis story. We don't know who that guy was either. But for the sake of our discussion now, there's a long period of time between Joseph and the circumstances of Exodus 1. So it's not just the next guy that all of a sudden didn't like Joseph. No, there are hundreds of years have gone past. And this guy, as Carpenter says, either doesn't know anything about Joseph or really doesn't care. Now that brings us, I want to skip down to verses 11 through 14. I'm going to read them again. Therefore, again, the growth of the people of Israel has alarmed the Pharaoh, whoever he is. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Raamses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves. It made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Now, I'm going to focus in on certain parts of this. I'm going to, for the most part, skip the matter of the names Pithom and Ramses. We're going to spend, believe it or not, an entire episode in part 2 on, do those two names help us situate chronologically the time of the bondage, and thus the time of the Exodus, and thus the time of Joseph. It is, as I said in the introduction, a quagmire. It literally needs, and it's hard to cram it into one episode, it literally needs its own episode because there's so much data that is either mutually contradictory or works in a variety of views of the chronology and the dating of these events, or is sort of just ambiguous. There's just a lot that goes into it. So that's what our part 2 is going to be based on. But for now, I want to just ask you a question. You think about what I just read, what parts of verses 11 through 14 sound familiar? Like they might be drawn from the Babel story. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. Okay, that's verse 12. Spread abroad. Okay, that term is used in Genesis 28:14, the same Hebrew lemma, where it says, your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and the east, the north and the south, and in you and your offspring all the families of the earth will be blessed. It's a direct reference to the promise, given to Abraham and Sarah about their seed. They're the new Adam and Eve. They are the chosen ones after the Babel event. You get other Hebrew lemmas that mean spread out, dispersed, spread abroad in Genesis 11, specifically Genesis 11:4 and verses 8 and 9. Reading from the Babel story, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed, lest we be spread out over the face of the whole earth. Well, here, we're talking about just Egypt, and the people, Abraham's seed, are spreading out, and the whole point is that God's original promise, God's original desire, that His people spread out, everywhere, do as He commanded, that is in operation. We talked a few episodes ago, about how the blessing of Jacob to Joseph actually contains reference to the Gentiles, the seed of Ephraim. Okay, if you remember that, if you didn't listen to that episode, you should go back and listen to that. It's in the Day of the Lord episode. Again, all of the seed thoughts, pardon the pun, are in Abram's seed about the people of God, Jew and Gentile, fulfilling God's original wish after the flood at Babel, and way back in Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply. Spread out over all the earth, because you're going to have to subdue it and bring it into dominion. Okay, all of these things are textual and conceptual clues that are linked together about what God is doing despite the opposition of Egypt, who's going to be portrayed as the new Babel. Mortar and brick, okay, that show up here in Exodus 1, verse 14. They made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick. The only place where those two lemmas show up with the spreading abroad idea, again, other lemmas, there are only two places in the Bible where that combination occurs: Exodus 1 and Genesis 11. Again, the writer wants his readers to think not only about, hey, God's keeping His promises, like Abraham and Sarah, we're going to have a multitude of families. Look at that. That's neat. It is, but he brings along with that the context of Babel. It's intentional. It's deliberate. It's the only other place where these things occur. The writing is casting Egypt as the new Babel, the new referent point of chaos, of opposition to God's will. Remember, chaos is opposition. It's a metaphor. It's a symbol in ancient Near Eastern thought. But ironically, again, the harder the new Babel, Egypt, tries to oppress Yahweh's portion, Israel. Remember Deuteronomy 32:8-9, when the Most High divided up the nations. That's the Babel event. He divided them up. He fixed the boundaries according to the number of the sons of God. But Israel is Yahweh's portion. Jacob is His allotted inheritance. So the harder the new Babel tries to oppress Yahweh's portion, the larger it grows. And the message is that Yahweh is fulfilling His promises, no matter what the forces of chaos do. Babel, chaos, all the human and supernatural forces, combined, everything that opposes God's plan will not undermine His purposes through His people. The very people through whom one will come, again, one of those one seed of Abraham will come, and specifically part of His mission is to reverse Babel, to bring the nations back into the family of Abraham. And all the children of Abraham, you're called a child of Abraham in the New Testament, not because of your physical genealogy, your ethnicity. It's not the fact that you're Jewish. If you are Christ's, you are Abraham's seed. It's Galatians 3. Or just read Galatians 3:27-29. Really the whole chapter, but those are the verses that sort of deliver the punch. If you are Christ's, you are Abraham's seed, an heir according to the promise. And it's Christ who reverses, the singular seed of Abraham that reverses all of this. So what the writer is doing in Exodus is he wants the reader to think about, God is raising up a seed, the seed of Abraham, and that's wonderful. but he's also bringing the, again, Deuteronomy 32 worldview context along with it. He's bringing Babel along with it. There are other, there are other really, really subtle things that, if we were reading in Hebrew, the whole thing about making their lives bitter. It's marar, the Hebrew lemma. Marad is very close to that, and it means to rebel, rebellion. You get that show up in the account of Nimrod, again, who is cast as the king of Babel in the Old Testament. You get these little sort of exegetical linguistic little tidbits, these possibilities of what might be going on here. Again, there are other ones. I don't want to rabbit trail too much on this, but there are things that connect the two. One more. Leviathan, of course, is a very well-known symbol for chaos in Canaanite, the dragon, all right? And the Babylonian version of the chaos dragon was Tiamat. And everybody in the ancient world knows this stuff. Yeah, if we were Canaanites, we'd talk about Lotan, Litanu, again, and Baal is the one who defeats Litanu and brings order to everything and becomes king of the gods, wonderful Baal, all this stuff. If you were a Babylonian, you would say, well, the great chaos monster, Tiamat, our equivalent of Leviathan, that's who Marduk defeats, and Marduk does the same thing, brings order, into the world, and blah, 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 blah. Well, guess who else gets called Leviathan in the Old Testament? Egypt. It's not a coincidence. Again, Egypt, not in Exodus, it's in the prophets, but Egypt, again, not only here in Exodus 1, but elsewhere, is tarred and feathered, as it were, with the same chaos symbology. And these things are not accidental. The writers, whether it's the writer of Exodus or one of the prophets, wants his readers in those cases to think about Egypt as a chaos force, and that we get plenty of that right here. Now, to continue on with we need to talk about the nature of the servitude here. The whole issue of the slavery in Egypt, verse 11, the first part of it, therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities. And then later in the passage, they made their lives bitter with hard service in brick and mortar, or in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Now, Durham, again, has a note here about the store cities that may or may not give us any help, let's put it that way, give us any help with the chronology. But there's also an issue of is this portrayal historically accurate? So there's a couple points to sort of cover with respect to the nature of the slavery. Without getting deep into the chronology, which we're going to do next time, I'll just read what Durham says here, and then we'll use that as a springboard to get into some of the other points of controversy. Durham writes, the specific territory the king has in mind, again with these storehouse cities, is indicated not only by the accounts of Genesis and Israel's settlement in Goshen. That's Genesis 47. You have the district of Ramses, but especially by the designation of the supply cities as Pithom and Ramses in the Masoretic text, to which the Septuagint, interestingly enough, adds On, which is Heliopolis. These cities were all in the Delta region, and all were associated with the vigorous building and rebuilding projects of the 19th dynasty. And end of quote. Now, the reason that that's a little bit interesting is Joseph, who's the woman he's given to marry. He's given a priestess, Asenath, the priestess or the daughter of the high priest of On, Heliopolis. So the Septuagint actually sort of pegs this district here in Exodus 1:11 as being the same. He associates it with Joseph by virtue of this specific reference to On, the Heliopolis, where this woman was from. The other interesting point is that Pithom and Ramses, Durham says, and he's making a bit of an assumption here, were associated with the 19th dynasty. This is the dynasty of Ramses II, Ramses the Great. Now, that's all well and good. But as we discuss next time, that is not, in fact, it is quite far from a slam dunk for associating this time period described in Exodus 1 with Ramses II, Ramses the Great. Now, I know Charlton Heston, and Yul Brynner, okay, it was Moses against Ramses, Ramses the Great. I get it. Yul Brynner's dad, Seti the First, is the king before Ramses II. So the movie, of course, assumes that the king here, for both the bondage and the Exodus, which is another mistake, is Ramses II. Even the cartoon, the Spielberg, Prince of Egypt, makes this assumption. This is the dominant view. And as a proof text for that, people go to Exodus 1:11 and say, look, they're building stuff for Ramses. I mean, who else can that refer to? We'll get to that. We'll get to that in part 2. Let's segue to a bit of another note. In this note, verse 11, the king is called Pharaoh for the first time in the ongoing narrative of the book. We're in chapter 1, so it takes 11 verses, but the king is identified as Pharaoh. The Hebrew term is a transliteration. The Hebrew is paro. That is a transliteration of the Egyptian word per-aa, which referred originally to the royal palace and the king's court, but came by the time of Akhenaten to be used also as a respectful royal title for one individual. Eventually, by the 19th dynasty, there we go with the 19th dynasty again, time of Ramses II. By the 19th dynasty, per-aa, Pharaoh, was used as it is here in Exodus 1. And Gardner's, Sir Alan Gardner, famous Egyptologist, the guy who wrote Gardner's Egyptian Grammar, all that, he has an article actually on this, and he's right. I mean, that's what the data are. Pharaoh is only used to refer to households, sort of administrations. Think of our modern equivalent of White House. Okay, the White House, the phrase White House can refer to an administration or a single individual, depending on how it's used. Well, the White House said today, well, if it was President Trump saying that, well, again, we can do that math. That's the way per-aa, Pharaoh, was used from the 19th dynasty, slipping back into the 18th dynasty if we want to get a little bit earlier. And there's some legitimacy for that. But 18th, 19th dynasty onward, the term becomes used for an individual. Now, if you're thinking already about the chronology issue, you're thinking, well, good grief. How can we possibly hold then to the early date of the Exodus? And if you don't know what these terms are, I'll just, here's a little parentheses. When we get into chronology next week, I'm going to be talking about the early date and the late date for the Exodus. Early date is 1446 BC. Okay, that's 18th dynasty. It's prior to this time. 1446 BC is a number that comes from 1 Kings 6:1, where it says, in the 4th year of Solomon, and basically everybody agrees Solomon got to the throne around 970 BC. So his 4th year is 966. The 4th year of Solomon was the 480th anniversary of the Exodus from Egypt. So you just do the math. 966 minus 480, because we're going backward, 1446 BC. What could be simpler? Well, a whole lot of things can be simpler, as we'll see next week. The late date, though, wants to put the Exodus in the time of Ramses, roughly 200 years later. Okay? And you say, well, how can they do that if 1 Kings 6:1 gives us the math? Well, they would say, well, 480, interestingly enough, is 12 times 40. 40 is a generation. Maybe it just means 12 generations, and we don't have an exact chronology. Generations can be less than 40 years. Generations really when a male reaches adulthood and starts having children, and 40, again, is a symbolic number throughout the Old Testament. Again, that's well known. So they don't take the number literally, and they feel comfortable with that because they want the Exodus to be during the time of Ramses II because of verses like this, Exodus 1:11, and also because of the Egyptological data about a term like per-aa, Pharaoh, only used of an individual like it is here in Exodus 1:11 for the 19th dynasty onward. Okay, we're going to get into all of this next week, but that's just telegraphing it. So, we've got here a situation where let's agree for the sake of this episode that the Israelites have tough lives. They're in bondage. Can we just move on now? Well, we could, except that there's a lot of bickering about this description. There are critical scholars out there who will say, look, The only people in Israel that could rightly be called, or the only people in Egypt that could rightly be called slaves, are military captives, prisoners of war. They were made slaves. They would say major Egyptian monuments. Now catch my wording here. I'm being deliberate here. Major Egyptian monuments, and the wonderful example, of course, are the pyramids, were built by trained, skilled laborers. They were native Egyptians they were like masons, okay? That this is what they did. And when the pyramids were built and other, again, significant monuments, you actually had people move into the area. They built towns to sustain the worker population. They were well fed. This is the job you wanted because you got more food than anybody else. You were waited on in that respect. You had to be maintained. You had to be physically vigorous and strong. So this was a good life, to work for Pharaoh as a mason, somebody who did, the labor's hard, but hey, it's a building project. There's going to be another one after this. It's job security. We're good. They were not slaves. And all that's true. Of course, the assumption is that we classify Pithom and Ramses as monuments or, major building projects that were looked on at the same way as the pyramids and certain temples were. Okay, so that's a big assumption. But it's often made. You get, scholars, again, that just want to pick at what's going on there, as though to say that the description of the Israelites as slaves is incorrect. Again, what's incorrect is the assumption that foreigners, therefore, were never put under hard labor, forcible, hard labor. That in to be honest with you, and again, we'll get into some of the data here, that might be actually worse than a slave situation. There are indications that what we're dealing with is a little bit different here. It's not, again, a work crew, but it's not really a prisoner of war, kind of situation either. So let me just mention Sarna here. I've loaded this article into the podcast article archive that you can access if you're a newsletter subscriber. In regard to this idea of some objecting, again, to the recounting of the bondage, again, by saying the picture doesn't fit. Nahum Sarna has a nice article on this. It kind of goes through the data pretty well. And he writes this: for his vast building program, Ramses II, again, Sarna is with the consensus. He's going to assume this is Ramses II here, his time. Okay. For his vast building program, Ramses II preferred to conscript foreigners in the area rather than native Egyptians. Such was reported by the Greco-Roman historian Diodorus Siculus, 1st century BC, who apparently relied on trustworthy Egyptian sources. The enslavement of the Israelites falls into the category that Diodorus describes. It was not a domestic bondage, the type in which an individual becomes the chattel of a private master and lives in his household, although this type of slavery is well attested in Egypt. There's no evidence that the Israelite women were enslaved or that slavery involved the dissolution of the family unit. Now, if you were a POW, this is me breaking it now. If you were in a POW, you don't have any hope of that. Back to Sarna. So there's no evidence that the women were enslaved or that slavery involved the dissolution of the family unit. In fact, one text shows in the Bible that the Israelites could live next door to or even in the same house as Egyptians and maintain social relations with them. And he quotes Exodus 3:22 in this regard. And I'll read it. Each woman shall borrow from her neighbor and the lodger in her house objects of silver and gold and cloth clothing, and you shall put these on your sons and daughters, thus stripping the Egyptians. Now, the point is that when that sort of prophecy is given in Exodus 3, that's the burning bush scene. There's a reference made to Israelite women being neighbors to Egyptians. That isn't the normal, that's not your POW slave lifestyle there. It's just not the same thing. Back to Sarna. What we are dealing with is state slavery, the organized imposition of forced labor upon the male population for long and indefinite terms of service under degrading and brutal conditions. The men so conscripted received no rewards for their labors. They enjoyed no civil rights, and their lot was generally much worse than that of a household slave. So what Sarna is basically pointing out, again, you can read the whole article, there were different kinds of slaves in Egypt. It's not just, again, POWs. So when you see these kinds of arguments, made to sort of delegitimize the description of Exodus 1, they just don't hold up, under the data. So the description of the bondage is not, something that is non-historical. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about another issue here. The dramatic growth, again, of the population. Again, we mentioned this a little bit, about how 70, the earlier reference to the 70 was a subset. Now you've got the people of Israel expanding dramatically throughout Egypt. There's an issue here with, if we just ask the question, well, is there anything like in Egyptian history, Egyptian texts, where we have large numbers of Semites, Semitic people living in Egypt? And specifically, the area of Goshen, which is the eastern delta, northeastern delta region. I guess eastern is probably a better way to describe it. Is there anything like that? And yes, there is. So we have a dramatic growth of a Semitic population in Goshen, in the delta area. And that has led most scholars to identify the Hyksos period, that's Hyksos, the Hyksos period, as the backdrop period to the bondage. Now, let me just unpack that a little bit. Hyksos is actually a Greek term, and it's the Greek version of an Egyptian phrase, hekau kasut, which means rulers of or from foreign lands. Now, the Hyksos period, there was a period in Egyptian history where you had a numerically significant concentration of Semitic people living in the Delta region in Egypt. That period is known as the Second Intermediate Period. It's the 16th to the 18th dynasties in Egypt. The Hyksos, in other words, it's before Ramses, okay? So try to get this mental picture in your head. If you think the pharaoh of the Exodus, the pharaoh of Exodus 1, and the Exodus story is Ramses. Well, preceding him, there was this period when you had lots of Semites living in Goshen, living in the Delta region. And they were hated by the native Egyptians. They were foreign rulers. That's, rulers from foreign lands. You actually had Hyksos pharaohs, okay, in two of these dynasties. They actually got to that position where Egypt was, breaking down. If you look at Egyptian history, you have like kingdoms: Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, and in between each of those, you have these intermediate periods. That's what scholars refer to them as. If it's an intermediate period, it's a time of chaos in Egypt. There's no one pharaoh. There's no central authority. You might have 5 or 6 pharaohs, okay? You got a bunch of guys running around saying, we're the pharaoh, and they're not asking for votes either. They're trying to take over turf, or they're content to just control districts of Egypt. Egypt is fragmented in the intermediate periods, and it takes a strong hand, a strong force to reunite the entire country and usher in a new rule. So that's why you get the Old Kingdom, that's the Pyramid Age, then things break down. You got a first intermediate period. Then you have the Middle Kingdom where things are consolidated again, and that breaks down eventually, and you got the second intermediate period. That's the Hyksos period. Then after that, you've got the New Kingdom, and this is dynasty 18, 19, 20. This is when somewhere in there, the biblical events of the bondage and the Exodus, are occurring or thought to occur. So if we look at the Hyksos period, again, the consensus view among Egyptologists and biblical scholars is that the period of the bondage is at the very end. It actually is sort of an after effect of the Hyksos period. So for a few hundred years earlier than this, what happens in Egyptian history, according to Egyptian records, is the Hyksos are finally dealt with. Egypt is consolidated, and the Hyksos are literally driven out of the country. They go into the Negev, into Canaan, and all this kind. They are literally driven out. They're not chased like in the Exodus story. They are driven out because they're hated, and any that were left in Egypt they enslaved because they hated them. So the consensus view is that the period of the bondage follows the Hyksos period. It's part of a reaction against the hated Hyksos Semites, and so they tend to put, again, the consensus view tends to put Joseph somewhere in this Hyksos period, because Joseph was a Semite. He had to have lived during the second intermediate period, the time of the Hyksos. Now, if you accept all that, you cannot hold to the early date of the Exodus, because you have to have Joseph in Egypt before the Exodus. If the Exodus is in 1446 BC, that means Joseph is around earlier, and that ain't anywhere near the Hyksos period. If you think Joseph belongs in the Hyksos period, then you have to hold the late date, the non-literal number. Time of Ramses, 1250 or so, the Exodus. You have to reject the early date, which is based on the math given, the literalized math given in 1 Kings 6:1. Okay? So that's what we're dealing with here. Now, the idea, again, just to go over this a little bit more, is not that the Israelites were to be equated totally with the Hyksos. The Hyksos are a conglomeration of ethnic groups, specifically, mostly, predominantly Semites. They infiltrated into the land over a long period of time. This is Sarna's article. I'll quote a little bit from it. They were a conglomeration of ethnic groups. They infiltrated the land over a long period of time in ever-increasing numbers. They come from Canaan, somewhere up there. They were fully in control of the eastern delta of the Nile. They established a capital at Avaris. The Hyksos constitute the 15th and 16th dynasties, again, two of the dynasties in this period. They adapted the style and bureaucratic institutions of the traditional pharaohs. They wanted to be like the pharaohs. Gradually, the Semites replaced Egyptians in high administrative offices. And so Sarna believes that Joseph belongs in this period. Now, again, that makes good sense with a late date. It's impossible for the early date. The whole notion of pharaoh, Egyptian, for pharaoh, only being a new kingdom, 19th dynasty, maybe the 18th dynasty a little bit, but onward. In other words, after the Hyksos period. That goes with the late date too. Again, things are looking good for the late date here, which is why we need to spend a whole week, a whole episode, on the current chronological issues, because the late date has problems. Okay, so don't just be clicking your heels if you're a late dater and saying, well, problem solved, end of story. No, it's a whole lot more complicated than that. Now, in regard to Joseph, let's just talk about him a little bit. If Joseph is part of this Hyksos period, if the Hyksos period is what we're looking at here in Exodus 1, the tail end of it, the very end of it, the question is pretty simple. Does Joseph fit what's said about him in the Hyksos period? Does he fit? Or, for the early date, would he fit in the period prior to the Hyksos period? Prior to the second intermediate period, that would be the Middle Kingdom. Does Joseph fit there better? Which era does Joseph fit in, and which does he fit better? Those are two related but different questions. The short answer is you can make him fit in either. Depending on how you take certain things, again, especially if you want to support the early date, if you're convinced that, you can get Joseph in the Middle Kingdom and feel good about it. You really can. Questions like, does it make sense, to have a Semite rise to the height of power like Joseph did in a period other than the Hyksos period? Again, this is kind of how the debates go. So just to say a little bit about this, some of the elements of the Joseph story seem to fit the Hyksos context, second intermediate period, pretty well. There's a large Semitic presence there, including a power base, obviously, but there are some pretty serious disconnections. The biblical text, for instance, nowhere states that Joseph was one among many Semites in rulership. See, if you're dealing with the Hyksos context, basically everybody in the administration is a Semite. Okay, is that really the picture that emerges from the Joseph story? Well, not so much. Another one, Joseph, when he meets Pharaoh, he has to shave and put clean clothing on. Well, why shave if Pharaoh was a Semite or used to Semites? There are lots of Semites running around here. They grow beards. Seems to be a native Egyptian context. Now, you could argue, on the flip side, well, the Hyksos wanted to be like the pharaohs, so they just kept the rules. Yeah, you can argue that. But it's an oddity. It can go either way. Another example, Joseph is given a daughter to marry of the priest of On, Heliopolis. On, Heliopolis, you can probably tell from the name of the city, the Greek version of it was a city dedicated to a sun deity. However, the Hyksos didn't worship the sun. They didn't worship a solar deity. They worshiped Set. Again, if Joseph is given the daughter of the priest of Heliopolis, the solar deity, that doesn't sound like Hyksos period. That sounds like a native Egyptian, some other period, because it's a solar deity. Another one. Archaeological work has produced evidence of high-ranking Semites in Egypt earlier than the Hyksos period. Now, David Roll, we'll come back to Roll again, especially next week. He's the patterns of evidence guy that they build a lot of that video off of his work. Roll uses this evidence. It's in particular, a statue, but a statue without a face. It's been defaced. There is evidence of Semites that were high-ranking in the Delta area. Politically, they were rich. They had beautiful houses. It's pretty obvious that they were high servants. Pharaoh. There's a statue with a mushroom-type hairstyle that's of particular interest here. And that's a hairstyle that's used of Asiatics. That's the Egyptian term for Semites, and other foreigners. There's a particular statue with this mushroom hairstyle, and you can see that hairstyle in other Egyptian art in a 12th dynasty palace. That's Middle Kingdom. Now, it suggests that the palace in which this was found belonged to a Semite. Why else would you make a statue of a Semitic guy? Must have been his palace. So Roll actually believes that the defaced statue is a statue of Joseph. Now that says too much. Basically, you just can't prove that. But at the very least, it shows a high-ranking Semite in Egypt, in the Delta, before the Hyksos. What about Joseph's titles? Okay, do they jive with the Middle Kingdom, or must they be Hyksos? Well, there's plenty of evidence, archaeologically and textually, for Semites in the Middle Kingdom generally before the Hyksos. You have the Beni Hassan mural. Joseph is called the overseer of the house under Potiphar. The Egyptian term, that's evidently, again, a Hebrew translation or transliteration. Translation in this case of Chari Per, which means literally he who is over the house. Again, this terminology does show up in Middle Kingdom Egyptian texts. Jim Hoffmeyer from Wheaton, he's an evangelical tradition. He's an Egyptologist. He was trained in Toronto. He cites the Brooklyn Papyrus here, which is dated late. It's very late, 660 to 330 BC. But everyone in Egyptology puts that in the Middle Kingdom because of not only its content, but its writing style. It matches the writing style of Middle Kingdom documents. Genesis 40:41 has Pharaoh declaring to Joseph, only as regards the throne will you be greater, or will I be greater than you. So Hoffmeyer notes that many take this to mean Joseph was elevated to the position of vizier, the highest ranking official in the realm. Most would argue that Joseph's duties, however, don't match the vizier's. There are famous studies on this. Hoffmeyer references them, studies by Ward and Van der Born. But Hoffmeyer points out that their research focuses on material from the New Kingdom, not on the Middle Kingdom. Middle Kingdom viziership is not as well known. There just isn't as much data. So Hoffmeyer says that this office for Joseph, the vizier office, can't be ruled out. He also points out that foreigners did hold lofty positions, including the viziership. There are Semites that actually were elevated to the level of vizier. There's one, in the New Kingdom, Seti I. He named a Syrian the, quote, great chancellor of the entire land. Again, the guy was a Semite. He's a Syrian. He's not a native Egyptian. He's from Syria. He's the great chancellor of the entire land. Isn't it interesting that Seti I, which, of course, the movie has as the father of Ramses II. But you can't have Joseph and Moses butt up against each other chronologically. So don't make too much hay out of that because it just doesn't work. But anyway, I thought I'd mention it. Another example would be under Hatshepsut. This is the famous woman pharaoh. She named a Semite as her vizier. You can read Hoffmeyer. His book, Israel in Egypt, is just chock full of data like this. I mean, you can read his take on this. He has other examples as well. Another instance we could cite, Genesis 45:8. Joseph is referred to as a father to Pharaoh. No such title is known in Egypt. Is that a problem? Well, depends how you look at it. Nearly all Egyptologists consider that phrase, a father to Pharaoh, to be a Hebrew placeholder for a father to the god, which is well known in Egypt. You say, well, how does that work? Well, it would refer to a chief advisor to Pharaoh who is, in Egyptian thinking, a god. The biblical writer apparently thought that the actual Egyptian phrase was either offensive or maybe confusing to his own readers, So instead of calling Joseph, you're going to be a father to the God, like to an Israelite, that's not going to make any sense, or it might be offensive. And so they change it, a father to Pharaoh. Pharaoh's a god, and so one works just as well as the other. Now, Wenham notes this in other passages. This is in the Hebrew Bible. Priests and prophets are spoken of as father to somebody else, even though they're not literal fathers. It's because, like real fathers, they instructed their quote-unquote sons, their people. It is often surmised that the underlying Egyptian title, again, quote, father of the god, was given to a variety of high officials, such as clergy, who advised Pharaoh. So it's really kind of a common title if you understand it that way. So in short, there's no obstacle to having Joseph in the Middle Kingdom. The early date can work. But there's nothing that rules out Joseph in the Hyksos period conclusively, so the late daters are happy too. This is what you get, when you're dealing, with this kind of material. So in Exodus 1, yes, we encounter a pharaoh. We encounter the names Pithom and Ramses, which we'll talk about next week. We encounter, contexts that, okay, we've got slavery. Everything descriptively about Exodus 1 can work well, not only historically. It affirms the broad general historicity of the account. In other words, are the details of the account, do they jive historically with details, with what we know of the culture of the place that the story describes? And the answer is yes. This takes us back to our introductory, discussion of, well, what's history? What's historiography? What does historical mean? What's mythic history? All these questions. Oftentimes in the Bible, if you're looking if you're latched onto a specific name like Moses and you say, well, I can't believe that this account is historical, this story about the guy Moses, unless I find the name Moses in some other text, that's really misguided. What you ought to be asking is, does the story about this guy Moses, does it fit in all its details with the place that Moses was said to be doing stuff? And the answer here in Exodus 1 is, yeah. There's nothing in Exodus 1 that renders it as unhistorical or as really even as difficult. You've got the slavery issue. Again, it's not just POWs. There are other kinds of slaves. You've got the Pithom and Ramses thing. You've got at least the Delta. Again, we'll talk about the names next time. You've got Semites in the Delta. That can work, of course, with the second intermediate period right before the New Kingdom when these events are taking place, or even earlier, the Middle Kingdom. The titles can work. Again, the only outlier in what we've discussed so far is Pharaoh itself, again, 18th dynasty and beyond. But that'll be an issue I'm saving that until next time. Exodus 1 certainly can be viewed as historical. There's no obstacle to it. Now, I want to hit on two other things before we quit for this episode real quickly. And that is, I'm just going to mention this, and you can go elsewhere to other things I've done about this. Inevitably, there are going to be some listeners that think, well, did the Israelites, they built the stuff for Pithom and Ramses, and I've seen the movie, and, did they build the pyramids? Did they build, like the Great Pyramid and Giza and all? No, they didn't. Chronologically, by either view, either the early or late, date for the Exodus, that cannot work by the Bible's own math. How old people were, X number of years between, two people, it can't work. Now, I've actually blogged this. The best place to go, though, is go up to Google, put in, did the Israelites build the pyramids? Okay, and then the website fringepop321.com. You'll be taken immediately to an essay about this. I wrote it I actually developed it a little bit more because of the Ben Carson thing. If we remember way back to the earlier presidential election, somebody came up with something that says that one of the presidential candidates, Ben Carson, believed that the Israelites had built the pyramids, and he does. He's totally wrong. It just can't work. I also made a Fringe Pop video about this. So if you go to YouTube, Fringe Pop 321, you'll find a video on this. So that's all I'm going to say about it. No. Exodus 1 is not evidence that the Israelites built the pyramids. Okay? Let's move on to verses 15 through 22 for the last element here of this episode. I'll read a little bit of it again. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as a midwife, to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool. That's going to be our key term, the birth stool. If it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, what's up? Why have you done this and let the male children live? And they said, the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, they're vigorous, they give birth before the midwife comes. Okay, that whole thing. Now, we've talked in an earlier episode of the podcast, specifically episode 210, about the ethics of deception. Does God use deception? And the answer is yes, he does. God himself uses deception to punish and thwart evil. So if you want a whole episode on that, go to episode 210 and listen to that. So I'm not going to get into that issue here. We've already covered it. I do want to get into the issue of this term, the birth stool. You say, well, good grief. I mean, what could possibly be interesting about that? Yes. Well, here we go. The term translated birth stool, and basically all your English translations have something like this, is Hebrew ovnaim. That term is used in Jeremiah 18:3 for the potter's wheel. Remember the famous passage in Jeremiah, potter fashioning the clay and God's the potter, and he makes us, and all that kind of stuff. That's important, what I just said. It's used in Jeremiah 18 for that imagery. Again, the potter's wheel imagery. Now, I got news for you, but the Hebrews, and the Egyptians for that matter, didn't use potter's wheels to have babies on. They just didn't. And I'm going to reference an article here. Again, I put this in the podcast article archive. You can get it if you subscribe to the newsletter. There's 2003, so it's not that recent, but there's an article by Scott Morshauser called Potter's Wheels and Pregnancies, a note on Exodus 1:16. That's very interesting. Literally in the Hebrew text, if we were looking at this in Hebrew and translating just the words that are there, it would not read the way it does in ESV or other translations. It would say, when you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and see the birth stool. You say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would I as a midwife go to an Israelite house and just look at the birth stool? Of course it doesn't make any sense. And so translators insert them into the translation, so it does make sense. And you see them, i.e. the Israelite women, on the birth stool. That isn't actually what the text says. So you have a grammatical problem. You see them, you see the birth stool. You see the ovnaim. And then this whole use of the same term, it's an unusual term. It doesn't occur much, but it does occur in Jeremiah 18:3 for a potter's wheel. What are we looking at here? There's another oddity. The midwives make up an excuse. Well, the Hebrew women are delivered, before the midwife gets there. Now, the oddity is, given that this Pharaoh in Exodus 1 has been portrayed as pretty ruthless and heartless, why would that answer be satisfactory at all? He doesn't retaliate against them. Why not? It just doesn't make sense. The whole way we understand this doesn't quite make sense. So Morshauser writes this: why would either a premature or unattended birth annul the main thrust of the royal command? If one accepts the usual interpretation of verse 16, the excuse offered by Shiphrah and Puah would not have solved their dilemma. The absence of a midwife would hardly have freed the women from their duty to their sovereign. You kill the boy. Back to Morshauser. They still would have the information necessary to carry out their task. They sure would. However, the next stage in this process, wherein the ruler ratchets up the pressure and demands that his subjects, not just the women, the midwives, but his subjects, drown the Hebrew infants, makes it probable that the midwives' mission had been formulated in a different fashion. Apparently, their order had been to eliminate the males prior to their birth, but once delivered, they were to be permitted to survive. That, again, I'll stop the quote there, and that explains why Pharaoh has to just tell the populace then, well, you got to get rid of the boys. Now, what Morshauser suggests, he suggested the phrase "upon the ovnaim," okay, or you see the ovnaim, you see that whole thing. He believes, and this is going to sound a little bizarre, but it actually makes some interesting sense. He believes that is the Hebrew equivalent of an Egyptian idiom based on a particular, very particular religious metaphor. Think of the potter's wheel here. Okay, Morshausen writes this: the potter's wheel is regularly linked to pregnancy in ancient Egyptian religious literature and art, not for the literal women, but in a different way. He writes, the implement, and this potter's wheel, was associated with the creator god Khnum, a ram-headed deity who was depicted as an artisan. In mythopoetic text, Khnum could mold and shape each human being at conception, quote, upon his wheel, unquote, with the potential child being granted the physical and psychological traits that would define it as an individual, obviously including characteristics of gender. During this time of fashioning, the developing infant was said to be, quote, upon the potter's wheel, unquote, from which it would hopefully be delivered hale and healthy. What is significant is that the metaphor refers to a gestating fetus prior to parturition. We suggest, Morshausen writes, that the Hebrew is an adaptation of the idiom and refers to a child still forming in the womb that has not yet come to full term. And so the point would be, when you look, at the child, again, just quoting Morshausen again, when you look or determine upon the potter's wheel, okay, and what he's saying is the Pharaoh is telling them, now look, you go visit the house and you're doing a prenatal exam. What's inside the womb there is upon the wheel, the potter's wheel of Khnum. Khnum is forming, what's inside there. Again, he's a pharaoh. He's an Egyptian. This is Egyptian religion. Okay, when you undertake this prenatal examination, if it is a son, then terminate it. Terminate him. If it is a daughter, she shall live. Such a procedure would have been within the scope of ancient Egyptian knowledge and practice. Medical texts contain prognostic recipes for determining the sex of an unborn child, as well as prescriptions for ending a pregnancy through droughts and potions. In other words, abortion. The Egyptians had abortifacients. They had a means to determine the gender of a fetus, still, in utero. And so that Morshausen, theorizes, and I think it makes good sense, especially with the Egyptian metaphor about the Khnum forming the contents of the womb on the potter's wheel, and ovnaim in the actual text in Exodus 1 is the word for potter's wheel. So what's going on here is that Pharaoh basically says, go into the house, give him the prenatal exam, determine the gender. If it's a boy, you kill him. But what Shiphrah and Puah say is, look, we went to the house, but they'd already had the kid. And then Pharaoh says, okay. But then he ratchets it up later. It's his plan isn't working. Again, the forces of chaos are not able, to accomplish their purposes here. The seed of Abraham is still growing. And then he gets desperate. He says, look, I'm just going to command. General edict commanded all his people. Verse 22, Pharaoh commanded all his people, not just the midwives. Every son that is born of the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. He just gets desperate because they're giving birth before the prenatal exam. Now, I think it's kind of interesting. You could do a number of things with this in regard to the whole abortion issue, because that's really what's in play here. Again, it's not a live birth. That isn't the issue until after the fact. Again, it's a point that I think that basically every English translation misses. And I think Morshausen's work here way back in 2003 is really useful here because it resolves the oddities and the incongruities of the passage. So that's our treatment of Exodus 1. Again, this part 1. Again, there was a lot to cover there, but there's going to be a lot to cover just with the chronology. So we had to take that out because that's really dense. The weeds are dense. It's a quagmire. I mean, here I am using metaphors myself, for the mess that this is. But again, I'm hoping that you already see why it's necessary, again, to split this up into two. But lots of interesting stuff there that a close reading of Exodus 1 can yield to you.
All right, Mike, seems like we're getting history, we're getting chronology, we're getting a little bit of everything.
Yeah, a little bit of esoteric Egyptian religion.
That's great. We love it. And we still got part 2 to go. So looking forward to that next week, Mike. All right. Well, I'll just go ahead and wrap it up. And we appreciate everyone that voted on Exodus because it's going to be a good one. With that, Mike, I just want to thank everybody else for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.